How's it going, everybody? I'm Courtland. I work at Stripe, and I run an online community of creators called Indie Hackers. Has anyone here ever been to Indie Hackers before? Okay, a few of you. The rest of you will all be new. So for the past 2 years, I've talked to about 350 creators on Indie Hackers about how they've come up with their ideas, about how they've turned their ideas into profitable businesses, and about how they've grown their businesses to the point where they can become financially independent and quit their jobs. But today I'm not going to talk about any of that stuff. Because after doing this for a while, I realized something weird. When people would come onto Indie Hackers and share their stories, they were always so confident. They talked about how they deliberately did all these great things that they knew all along would lead to their businesses growing. But then when I would meet these same people in person for coffee or for lunch and we'd sit down and talk face-to-face, one-on-one, things were different. They would open up a little bit more about their past failures, about the times where they felt insecure or uncertain about the future, and every now and then they would tell me stories about how some big breakthrough they had in the past actually was mostly a matter of luck. And so today, I'm going to do what most entrepreneurs would never do on a stage like this. I'm going to walk you through the story of my own business, and I'm going to focus on all the times where I just got lucky, times where things went really well for me, even though I didn't plan on it. Now, don't get me wrong, getting Indie Hackers to where it is today has not been an easy journey. I've literally put blood, sweat, and tears into my business, and so when I talk about luck, my goal is not, to display some false sense of humility. Rather, what I want to do is focus specifically on the reasons behind how and why I've been able to get lucky over and over again with my business, so that all of you can take these lessons and use them to create your own luck. I'll start at the beginning. July of 2016, almost exactly 2 years ago today, I was in sort of an awkward situation where I was living in San Francisco, paying obscene amounts of San Francisco rent, and I had no job. And I wasn't even looking for a job because I knew that what I wanted to do was start my own business and become financially independent. The only problem was I had no idea what I wanted to work on. So I came up with a plan. I certainly wasn't the first person to want to start a profitable online business. And so I decided that why don't I hop online and read a few other stories about other people who had started online businesses, and maybe by reading their stories it would get my creative juices flowing and I'd be inspired and come up with a good idea of my own. And so I got to work. I spent hours scouring the internet and reading story after story. And pretty quickly I ran into a roadblock, which is that I am a man of action. I need to be doing something. I need to be building or creating, and reading story after story about other people doing the thing that I wanted to do was driving me freaking insane. And so by the end of the day, I couldn't wait to actually get to work on something. But when I look back at my list of ideas, none of them sounded as good as they had when I'd first written them down earlier that day. In fact, they were all pretty embarrassingly bad. And I realized that it was going to be harder than I thought to come up with an idea to work on. By the end of day 2, I'd read probably 100 stories and come up with dozens of ideas, and all I wanted to do was stop brainstorming and get to work. But again, when I look back to my list of ideas, they weren't quite good enough. So I told myself, one more day. At some point during day 3, I just burned out completely. I don't know how many stories I'd read or how many ideas I'd come up with by that point in time, but I knew I didn't have the energy to keep going, and so I was on the verge of calling it quits, and then I got lucky. I came across a single comment left on a forum by this guy, Peter Levels. And in this comment, he shared the story of his business, just like most of the other stories I'd been reading, but something about Peter's story was different. He was very transparent and raw and honest and detailed in a way that no other story had been, and I knew that no matter what, I wanted to build my business in the same way that Peter had built his. And so I started thinking. Peter had collected information on what it was like to live as a digital nomad in cities all over the world, and he put them in one place so that other digital nomads, instead of having to do days worth of research, could go to his website and find everything that they needed to know. And then it hit me. What if I did the same thing that Peter did? What if I took all of these stories that I had been reading and I interviewed these founders and I put them in one place so that entrepreneurs like myself wouldn't have to do 3 days of grueling, painstaking research to find inspiration? It could even require people to share their revenue numbers and tell their stories in the same helpful and detailed way that Peter had shared his story. So I was like, yes, finally. I had an idea that I was excited about, I could stop, and it was mostly thanks to some random guy on the internet. If Peter Levels had not decided on a whim to sit down one day and share his story in that comment, and there would be no indie hackers, guaranteed, I would not be on this stage today. And my life would be completely different. Now, there's really nothing you can do to go out and create your own pewter levels, but the other half of the story is something that all of you can do, and that's keep going. Endure long enough to give luck a chance to strike. If I had stopped after 10 ideas, or 20 ideas, or even 50 ideas, there would be no indie hackers, because I would have stopped before I reached the point where I got lucky. And think about how ridiculous this is for a second. I'm sitting here deciding what I want to do for possibly the rest of my natural life, and I wanted to quit early because I got bored. Right? That's crazy, I think. But it happens to all of us, all the time. We're constantly faced with these singularly important decisions, the kind of decisions that you only really have to get right one time, but then we give up early because it's hard, or because it's scary, or because we're bored, or because we spread our focus over a million little things that don't matter and convince ourselves we don't have time to double down on the things that do matter. I think the luckiest people, when faced with this situation, roll the dice over and over and over, and they keep going until they get lucky or until they figure it out themselves, and usually it's some combination of both. Now, after I had my idea in hand, I needed to go back over all the stories that I'd read and contact these people to ask if I could interview them, which was easier said than done. I ended up tracking down hundreds of email addresses, and then I didn't want to be spammy, and so I handcrafted a personal email to each and every one of these people. This took me a very long time, and to make matters worse, most of these emails would either bounce or I'd get no response at all. And for the people who did respond, typically it was to tell me that, no, as a matter of fact, I don't want to do an interview on your random no-name website and share my revenue numbers with the world. And the few people who were crazy enough to say yes oftentimes wouldn't finish their interviews. And so after 3 weeks of sending hundreds of emails, I had this, just 11 or 12 interviews, most of which weren't that good. And I really had to cheat to get to that number. I interviewed myself, I interviewed one of my friends. One of those is like a fake interview where I just pieced together quotes. It was a far cry from what I originally imagined indie hackers would be. And so when it came time to launch, understandably, I was a little bit nervous. Right? I was nervous that things weren't going to go well. My plan was that I wanted to submit indie hackers to this online community called Hacker News, and it's full of developers and entrepreneurs who I thought would be the perfect audience to enjoy these interviews that I'd done. But Hacker News turns out to be an extremely competitive battleground where submissions duke it out every day to see who can get the most votes and get to the top. My chances of success were so low that I wasn't simply worried about not making it to the top, I was worried about not making it to the front page at all. Right? The worst case scenario was also the most likely case, that my launch would suck, that nobody would like my interviews or my website, and that the work I had spent the last month of my life doing would all be a complete waste of time. Of course, the alternative was that I don't promote my website at all, and the same outcome happens. And so on August 11th, I woke up early, and I crossed my fingers and went like this, and submitted my website to Hacker News, and I waited. But I didn't have to wait for very long. In the first 5 minutes, indie hackers got enough upvotes to make it to the front page, and in an hour, it was the #1 story on the top of Hacker News. In those first few days after launching, I got 200,000 page views from over 50,000 visitors. My mailing list went from 0 to 1,000 subscribers, and I was #1 not only on Hacker News, but on Product Hunt and different subreddits as well. And the best part for me was that people were actually emailing me now, asking if they could be interviewed for indie hackers, and instead of me having to go out and send cold emails. Those days were over. Now, this was crazy. It was a 180-degree turnaround from what I was predicting might happen beforehand, and that's because I had a trick. Right? Some of the story that I just told you is only half true, because I didn't actually do any of this stuff completely by myself. In fact, some of it I was barely even involved in, and yet somehow I found myself experiencing one lucky break after another. Because when I was nervous about launching indie hackers, when all I wanted to do was for the site to do well and for people to like it, it turns out that I wasn't alone. There were 10 other people who felt exactly the same way that I did, people who believed in indie hackers, people who had poured time and energy into making sure indie hackers was the best that it could be, and who had waited patiently anticipating its launch. And every one of them was just as excited and hopeful as I was in seeing their interviews get to the top of Hacker News. And so before I launched, I sent a single email to these 10 people who I interviewed, and that was it. From that point on, it wasn't just me launching indie hackers on my own. I had 10 times the effort going into making this launch a success. I had 10 times as many people sharing it with their audience, and I had 10 times as many chances to get lucky. On the day that Indie Hackers launched, there were viral tweets about Indie Hackers with dozens of retweets, and it turns out I didn't write any of these tweets. People like Peter Levels did, because I had interviewed him for the site. And the Sunday after I launched, somebody submitted Indie Hackers to Product Hunt, and it wasn't me, it was one of my people that I interviewed because he believed in indie hackers and he thought it could do well. So if you really want to increase your luck, find a way to get other people on your side pushing in the same direction that you are. Because a lot of luck really just comes down to other people deciding that they want to help you. So I kept going. Every week, I would interview 3 or 4 new founders, and in doing so, I was recruiting new and smart and capable and intelligent people to be on my side, and it continued to pay off. One day, about a month after I launched Indie Hackers, I woke up and I saw a massive traffic spike on my website. And this was confusing to me because I had just woken up, I hadn't really done anything. So I did a little digging, and it turned out it was due to this woman right here, Rosie Sherry. Now, I had just interviewed Rosie. She'd done a great interview, and apparently Rosie had taken it upon herself to promote her interview all over the web. And she'd done a much better job promoting her interview than I had been able to do promoting anybody else's interviews. And so, of course, I copied a few of Rosie's strategies, and I'm still using them today, and they've allowed me to get more than 11 million page views from 1.5 million people to Indie Hackers. Right? How lucky was I that I could go to sleep having done nothing and wake up to find thousands of people on my website and a new growth strategy delivered into my hands. Now, I've worked on dozens of projects and startups and websites over the past 10 years of my life, and Indie Hackers was the first, where it felt like people all over the world were doing their best just to help me out. Right? And it wasn't just the people that I interviewed. It was also the people who were retweeting these tweets, who were upvoting Indie Hacker submissions wherever they were. It was people who were sending me suggestions and tips and advice and introductions in my email inbox every single day. Right? Nothing like this had ever happened before with any of my past businesses, and the difference was that Indie Hackers was the first thing that I'd ever worked on that was bigger than myself. Right? In the past, the only thing that I ever focused on was how can I build my own business for myself? How can I make myself financially independent? And guess what? Nobody else cares about that goal. But with Indie Hackers, for the first time, I was helping other people accomplish their dreams and helping other people make their own lives more awesome. And so if you're an entrepreneur, you wanted Indie Hackers to do well because you wanted more people to share their stories and their strategies and their revenue numbers so that you could learn from what they were doing and have the same outcomes. So in the end, I found myself getting lucky over and over again because all of these people wanted help, and I'll never start another business where I don't try deliberately to make other people more awesome, and I'll never start another business where I don't align my incentives with other smart people who can push in the same direction that I am. And I think if you want to get lucky, that's the most important thing that you can do. Fast forward a few months to the end of 2016. Indie Hackers is doing extremely well. I'm getting 100,000 people coming to my website every month. The mailing list is growing like crazy, and I'm still doing 4 new interviews every week, but there's only one problem. I'm not making any money whatsoever. It turns out there's a limit to how far you can take the strategy of trying to make other people more awesome, and at some point you have to actually try to pay your own rent. Every week I would look at my bank account and I would see it dwindling closer and closer to zero, and I started to get nervous. So I did what anybody would do in the situation. I started a podcast. Right? Podcasts make oodles of money, right? All you have to do is get on the phone, record a conversation, hang up, and somehow rent money appears in your bank account. Obviously, that's not true, so I ended up focusing on a couple of other things as well. The first thing was that I opened up my website and my newsletter to sponsorships and advertisers, just to try to generate a little bit of cash. And this went okay. I had some good months and some bad months, but my advertising revenue never really got to the point where it had a chance of supporting my business. The last thing that I did was I spent a lot of time talking about the first 2 things. I would tweet about how difficult it was to find sponsors and advertisers, or I would email my newsletter about all the different steps involved in setting up a podcast and getting it out the door. I would blog about all the things that I had tried, all the things that I was planning to try, and I would talk to pretty much any person who was willing to listen. Luckily for me, one of these people was Jeff Meyerson. Now, Jeff is the host of a podcast called Software Engineering Daily, and apparently he read one of my blog posts, and he decided to send me an email. And he said, "Hey, Courtland, I see you're trying to start a podcast, and I see that you're looking for sponsors. Well, I just so happen to run a podcast that has a ton of sponsors, so why don't I just share my process with you and give you a leg up?" And so we did. We got on the phone, and during this phone call, Jeff also said, "Hey, while we're at it, why don't I just give you the exact email addresses of the people that you should email to get sponsorships?" And he did. Holy shit, it was like putting in the cheat codes to a video game, because barely a month after my podcast launched, I made $6,000 worth of sponsorships, which is barely enough to pay rent in San Francisco. And this is in large part thanks to the advice and the leads that Jeff had given me. It was a tremendously lucky break, and it happened for one reason, and that's that I was talking in public about what I was doing. Right? I was sharing everything. And it turns out that even if people like you, and even if people want to help you, sometimes it's hard for them to help if they don't know what you're doing, right? If someone wants to help you, but they don't know what it is you're trying to accomplish, then they end up having to guess. And unfortunately, most people don't like spending their days sitting around guessing how they can help you, right? You need to make it easy for people, right? And out of all the people who are willing to guess, most of them are probably going to guess wrong if you haven't told them what you need help with, right? I guarantee you, a lot of you in this audience right now have emails sitting in your inbox from your clients or family or friends or customers who are trying to help you, and they just missed the mark because they didn't really understand how it was they could best help you. Every one of those is a missed opportunity to get lucky. Now, I'm not saying that you need to beg for help, right? You don't need to go out and start a GoFundMe and ask people to give you money. It's not about asking for money. It's simply about talking about what it is that you're trying to do, right? The only requirements are that you be honest about your goals, that you be specific about the challenges that you're facing and your plan for tackling them, and that you broadcast all of this to the right people. That's it. Now, it's not easy. That kind of openness and transparency is nerve-wracking because you're basically telling the world that you don't know exactly what you're doing, but it's still worth it in the end, right? I've interviewed hundreds of creators on Indie Hackers, and they've told me so many stories about lucky things that have happened to them. They've told me about partnerships and deals and hires and tips and advice and acquisitions and sales that they've made because they decided to broadcast their stories with the world. In March of 2017, 7 months after I launched Indie Hackers, I got an email, and it was from Patrick Collison, the CEO of Stripe. And the subject line said, "Acquire Indie Hackers." He wanted to know if Stripe could buy my company, and I was floored, to say the least. In fact, you can see Eva in the list of recipients. That's my mom. She's my biggest cheerleader. I immediately forwarded this email to her. The deal was beyond my wildest dreams in terms of outcomes for Indie Hackers, but here's the thing. Patrick's email came completely out of the blue. I didn't know Patrick. I didn't know anyone else at Stripe, for that matter. I didn't do a single thing to try to cause this acquisition to happen. I just got lucky. Let me tell you another story. In 1987, I was born in the United States of America, and I was born healthy, and I had two responsible middle-class parents who raised me in a safe environment, who believed in spending time with their children, and who believed in unconditional love. Again, sometimes you just get lucky, right? This saved me from fighting half a dozen battles that I might have had to fight otherwise, and I did nothing at all to deserve this. And I think luck is something that we should all be aware of. We should all be willing to admit exists, not only because it helps us paint a clearer picture of our own lives and how we got to where we are today, but because it helps us have compassion for others. But for the times where you want to be in control, for the times where you want to actually go out and create your own luck, just remember these 4 things. Get other people on your side. Do your best to make them awesome. Tell them what you're trying to do, and never quit before you give luck a chance to strike. Thanks.